Hi, my name is Mark Thorsby, and this is Phenomenology. We're looking at Edmund Husserl's text, Ideas Pertaining to a Pure Phenomenology and to a Pure Phenomenological Philosophy, Book 1. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you guys are doing well. In this video, we're going to sort of jump in, and we're going to start by taking a look at Part 2, Chapter 1 of Husserl's text, Ideas 1. So Part 2, the title for this next sort of section we're opening up here is called The Considerations Fundamental to Phenomenology. You'll recall that up to this point in the videos, what we've seen Husserl make pretty strong objections against the philosophical position of naturalism, if you will. And I won't sort of go through that now. And he's talked about phenomenology. And when we looked at his text, the Phenomenology or Philosophy as Rigorous Science, we saw that Husserl wants to articulate an eidetic science, that is a science of essences, that's thorough and certain. And so first he's dislodged naturalism. And we're going to see in this second part, he's going to start to lay the groundwork for phenomenology proper, especially in these first two chapters we're taking a look at. So chapter 1 here is the title is the Positing, which belongs to the natural attitude and its exclusion. So this is a very, very important chapter for Husserl, although it's fairly brief actually. Now, he continues on with the section numeration, right? So section 27 begins with the world of the natural attitude, I and my surrounding world. Okay, and we're going to see at this point, Husserl sort of wants to say, well, when we talk about our experience of the world and the phenomena we're experiencing, because remember, the essences that we're after in philosophy, like think about the essence of justice, i.e. Plato, for instance, or you think about the essence of numbers for the mathematician, right? All of these essences occur as forms of experience in our subjective field of cognition. But we have to sort of begin our analysis of cognition and not just cognition, but consciousness by looking at, well, what does it mean to have an experience? And Husserl wants to say, well, let's just start with our sort of basic worldview. That is, the way in which we actually approach the way in which most of our experiences are actually characterized. And they're characterized by what he calls the natural attitude. Now, the natural attitude, of course, you can see here, he's obviously thinking of naturalism in the background. And part of the reason here is because he thinks that naturalism confuses the rigorous scientific evaluation of certain eidetic concepts with the sense of attitude we have in our natural sort of sense. And we're going to see that he talks about, and we've mentioned it, the philosophical attitude and how that's different than the natural attitude. But what is the natural attitude? Now, in doing this investigation, right, we can do this investigation in the first person singular. I'm sort of fond of telling students have been trained to give up the first person singular, the word I. And really what we see with Husserl's methodology is because we ultimately, it's cognition that you're exploring, it's your cognition that you're exploring. So the first person singular is not just convenient, it is in fact maintains a fidelity to what you're actually describing, right? He says, I am conscious of a world that's endlessly spread out in space, endlessly becoming and having endlessly become in time, right? I'm conscious of it, and that signifies above all that intuitively I find it immediately, that I experience it, right? And he's describing the sense that when I look here at the can of seltzer water, right, is what I'm drinking here, when I look at the can of seltzer water, I grasp it intuitively as being in the world and being within a sort of field of that's both in space but also in time, endlessly spread out before me. So it's sort of it's a very beautiful passage, and I think in many ways we really start to see the Husserl of the logical investigation start to shine. So we go back to this first person singular and think about the natural attitude. Now, for instance, you can take your own experience, describe your own experience, and we've done this in the class where, for instance, I've asked you to give a description of what your daily life is like, right? And when you take that experience, what are some of the characteristics essential to that average everyday experience in which I experience the world as endlessly before me, right? And it's there for me immediately and intuitively as an object, right? And he says, well, number one, it's simply there, right? It's on hand. It's on hand. And this is a sort of good moment because you're going to see when we get to Heidegger in a couple weeks here. Heidegger is going to also use the language of the hand, right? And but you can sort of see it. You grab the seltzer water bottle or can. I'm sorry. And this is an example where the world is at hand. That is, it's something there for me to use. It's something that I can manipulate and relate myself to. But it's just simply there, as it were. And this world, this experience, presents actualities in the field of intuition. Now, remember, think about intuition for Husserl here as really being something like the receiving capacity we have for the world, which is sort of actual, which, what did I say? It Our intuition is what primes us to understand and cognize an experience of the world as simply there, right? But these are all presented as actualities, that is, as things endowed with reality. And things are found directly in the field of perception here, right? So my perception, of course, not just my eyes, though the eyes are generally privileged by philosophers, because I mean, right, many philosophers have talked about this. The eyes, for instance, seem to give us so much with so little effort on our part, right? Um, my knowledge of these objects that I experience in the world involves no conceptual thinking, as it were, which changes into sort of clear intuiting, right? And this is sort of an important thing. For instance, earlier today, I was actually having a discussion with some of my students in another class about Plato, and Plato's conception of the soul and the intellect and all these sorts of things. But there's something that's fundamentally missing in Plato's conception because Plato describes the soul as this rational element that captures and grasps intellectual, ideal, transcendent entities. But there's something fundamentally not right about that in terms of trying to describe the actual experience I have on the day-to-day world, right? I don't when I see actually it's funny because this has been sitting here, that was from earlier today. But for instance, here's my cup of water, right? But when I look at my cup of water, right, there's no conceptual thinking that's required. I just grasp it in a clear intuiting, right? And that which is clearly intended is surrounded by what he calls obscurely intended to the horizon of an intermediate actuality, right? That is, there's these other actualities that are not yet quite there, which are also within my intuitive field. So, for instance, when I see, let's say I have ice in my glass of water, and when I look at the ice, right, it's typical that the cup is cold. Like I'm not perceiving at this moment that the cup is cold, but I intuit it as one of these actualities just on the other side of the horizon of what I am intending. And of course, I can actualize that, right? And so there's this. So in the natural attitude, you can see here what Husserl's doing is he's describing the positing, right? Remember he talks about the positing that we have in the natural attitude, or he will in here in a minute. But there's this sense in which our experience of phenomena brings with it an already given sense of actuality. And this is what he's going to refer to as a positing. Now, the obscurity of the indeterminate gets populated with intuitive possibilities, right? So here's another example. Is imagine, for instance, you're sitting on the horizon, and you're looking out into the horizon. The further you go out, even though it's spread out before you in endless space and time, as it were, in your experience, right? What's indeterminate, you start to populate, you start to fill in the gaps with possibilities that you recognize through not just your transcendental capacities, but in terms of your actual life of becoming accustomed and expecting things. There's expectations. And so, for instance, when I look out into the horizon and I see little things moving, I start to intuit the possibilities that these are other persons like myself, even though they are completely vague and ambiguous within my sense perception. So this is important because this means that in consciousness, our experience is not just limited to this sort of sensation quality, but there's this, if you will, this activity of intuition that we seem to have, in which we intuit possibilities along the horizon of our experience. Now, also, I recognize that everything is in time within this natural attitude, right? Everything has what Husserl calls a two-sided, infinite temporal horizon. This is the known and the unknown, right? So everything's in time. Now, you can obviously think, normally in time we would use the language of the past and the present, but take a look at it, right? And if I want to describe what I actually know, then what I can say is that the further something is into the past, the actual the well, no, I don't think that's what it means here, right? When I go into the past, I have an experience of what happened, and in that sense, something is in time. And then, of course, in the future, it's still unknown, right? So we can trace these interrelations of actualities that are immediately surrounded us, right? And now here's something that's very important, number 9, that Husserl suggests. And by the way, he doesn't give numbers here. I've just sort of laid out what I think are some of the key points. Um, Husserl recognizes that our standpoint in the natural attitude is not fixed. It can change. And it can not only change in terms of time and space, right? That is, I can move around the room and get a different concatenation of perspectives. But my standpoint's also not fixed in the sense that I'm I'm able, even from the same vantage point, from the same sitting position, as it were, to recognize and have a different perspective on the world. So consciousness is rich enough and fantastically accommodating to allow us this what looks like this really free play in our day-to-day lives, right? So in my day-to-day experience, I'm seeing the world and I'm seeing it in terms of this horizon of possibilities in space and in time. Some things are known, some things are unknown. There's an interrelations of actualities, right? But my standpoint is one in which it seems to be descriptively free phenomenally, right? I can move about, as it were. So the natural attitude is something that's also continually available to us, right? We're going to see, of course, he's going to um, differentiate or compare the natural attitude to other types of attitudes, such as the philosophical attitude, or he calls it the arithmetical attitude. I think that's funny to say, so I would call it the mathematical attitude. Um, and there's perhaps even the natural scientific attitude, right? There's these different types of attitudes that we can take on in the way in which we see and engage with the world. But the natural attitude is the one that always comes back, right? It's the one that's always available to me. That is, I'm always sort of seeing the world in terms of these interrelations of actualities that are not just outside me, but with me in an important sense. They're a part of the horizon of things that I perceive and intuit as immediately actual and available. Right. So physical objects, though, for instance, are of use. Physical objects of use are not only available, but I recognize certain value characteristics. Now, this is important because what it means is that our sense of the world, our natural everyday experience of the world, begins and includes a layer of value description, where we make value judgments and we recognize certain things as having value. So value is very important here. And of course, one of the questions in contemporary philosophy concerns moral realism and whether or not it's possible to make moral judgments that actually reflect reality. Now, we're not going to say that that's the case here, or even that Husserl say that, because that's certainly not what he's talking about. But it is relevant to consider here from Husserl's perspective that we do in fact experience the world always, if you will, with a layer of value that's organizing our perception of what we're perceiving, what we're seeing, right? So for instance, right now, I'll show you what I'm looking at. I'm looking at a little bucket of pens, and there's an eraser. And I can see here that, for instance, when I see the eraser, right, and I see the pen, and you can imagine if I'm writing, the pen, and I needed something to write with. The pen has more value in that circumstance, right? I perceive it as having that value. And so there's sort of value characteristics in the natural attitude. And also there's a social world, of course, right? We live in a world with others. And this world is also highly value laden. Okay, so moving to section 28, the sort of phrase that Husserl can capture out of the Cartesian discourse here is this conception of the cogito. Now, the title of this section is The Cogito, My Natural Surrounding World and the Ideal Surrounding Worlds, right? So here's the cogito, right? Now, all of the mental acts are going to be captured by this term. So any of these mental acts we have, whether it's judgment, whether it is a sort of perception, right? You can see that when we describe the natural attitude, we describe a whole bunch of different experiences and types or modes of experiences. And the word cogito can stand for all of that, right? And here it's really important. I think Husserl reminds us and would recommend that I remind you that the term cogito here, we need to strip it of its philosophical heritage here and really see it as a variable to talk about what we're describing in these phenomenological meditations and contemplations, right? Now, for instance, one field of cognition, of course, that's included is mathematics. It's mathematics. Now, on the one hand, when if you want to compare the experience I have in the natural attitude of looking at the water cup here, and if I want to compare that to the sort of cognition that takes place when I do mathematics, say for instance I'm looking at a diagram of a geometric proof of some sort, right? And I compare these. Now, one field of cognition includes this stuff, these mathematical objects. They're not real in the same sense that the cup is real. I don't treat that as real. Now, of course, Husserl's not denying the reality of mathematics here, and that's why I put it in scare quotes, that it's not a real actuality. But it's not. I don't treat it as an actuality in the same sense, right? And that's why, for instance, that's why people can say, well, mathematics doesn't help you in the real world. Why? Because the real world is populated with things that are actually available to me in my immediate field of cognition. Whereas these mathematical objects, there's something as it were I can attend to mentally, but they don't fill out the world in the same way, right? Now, but he does say, but all these mathematical things do have an actuality, in the sense that, for instance, if I'm looking at a geometric proof, right? Remember the proofs perhaps you did when you took trigonometry or analytic geometry in high school, right? That when you do these proofs, they are actual. They never change. They seem to be consistent. And they're always available to me so long as I'm in this arithmetical attitude. And so that's sort of the first thing. So the term cogito spans the range here. Now, one of the things we recognize is that we have sort of there's worlds of intention. There's worlds of intention, right? And these worlds of intention signify these different types of attitudes. So one of the questions you may be asking is, what exactly is the difference between the natural attitude and the arithmetical attitude and the philosophical attitude and whatever other attitude we postulate? What is the difference? Well, the difference is we're talking about different worlds of intention. Now, he's going to talk about intentionality quite a bit, so I don't want to go into too much depth on it now, but we have talked about the notion of intentionality. Intentionality refers to the directedness of our cognition, or I don't want to use the term cognition, the directedness of consciousness, right? And when you see the world and you direct your consciousness in your average everyday sense, where you assume there's nature and there's these different actualities that are immediately given to you in a non-voluntary sense, right? That signifies one type of world of intention. But when I turn my intention and my consciousness inwards, as it were, and I don't know if that's the right term, inwards here, and probably not, but when I turn it inwards and intend the sorts of mathematical objects, you think about what pi is and what radius is and diameters and parallelograms and how all of those features can function within geometric proof, right? There, I do have consciousness directionality, but it's towards a particular type of things, different sort of worlds, right? And that's what these attitudes refer to. Is they refer to different worlds of intentionality, right? So moving here to section 29. The other ego subjects in the intersubjective natural surrounding world. One of the really important things, one of the things that I'm most interested in personally in my own research, concerns the question of others. And it concerns the question of our experience of other people in the world. We experience others all the time. Now, but here's the thing: is that in the natural attitude, we treat others as ego subjects, which are like ourselves. Right? Let me scoot in there so you can see it. Right. So, for instance, if let's say I was just at a restaurant, I just had sushi, um, and for instance, the waitress was there, and she was very nice. Um, and for instance, I treated her, and I not just treat her, but I assume and I expect, and I have no other way of imagining her as anyone different than someone that's similar to me, that is in terms of being an ego subject who has consciousness and who has similar phenomenal experiences, right? I treat her as being someone like myself, as a subject of the world in the natural attitude. And I recognize that we are in the same objective world, right? That we're both in the same world. It's not just that she has consciousness and I have it, but that we have a common world, and but with that we intuit it within different modes, if you will, right? So, for instance, she's experiencing the world, the same world that I am, and we share the world, but she's experiencing it in a different mode than I am, right? I don't know what her attitude is, for instance, and I also don't know, for instance, even her physical perspective, her physical perceptions and sensations are different, right? She's perceiving the world over there, and I'm sitting here, and she's over there. So it's a difference, but there is a way in which, in the natural attitude, we treat others as being just like us, but just occupying a different position, right? That is, we come to an understanding with our fellow human being, and in common with them, posit an objective spatio-temporal actuality as our factually existent surrounding world to which we ourselves nonetheless belong. A couple spelling errors there, so my apologies. It's hard to always prove this stuff. So you can see here, this is that we just treat it as a sort of fact, right? And so this is sort of important. So what Husserl has done now is he sort of characterized this. And one thing I didn't mention is he's going to use this term intersubjective. Why? Because since I treat the other person as a subject, and I'm a subject, right, and they're a subject like me, that means that our social relationship can be referred to as intersubjective. That is, the place in which we as distinct subjects come together, right? That's all intersubjective means here. Now, in section 30, we see Husserl begin to discuss the general positing which characterizes the natural attitude. And I've mentioned this at the beginning. Now, the natural attitude is a description, and it's prior to any theory. So we haven't been doing, and what Husserl has not been doing in the second chapter, is trying to give us a theoretical, model for how to understand cognition and experience. He's just describing the way in which we actually do experience the world. And one of the things that's interesting is, even though people, especially certain analytic philosophers, are highly critical of phenomenology, you can see here that he is describing really the way in which we do, in fact, treat others in the world, right? He's not making this up, I don't think. It describes my experience perfectly, right? But what he wants to say here is that within this natural attitude, we have this conception of positing, right? And what does it mean to posit something? In the most simple way, you can say that to posit means to put forward, right? To say that something, it's not even to say something because he doesn't mean it in that sense, but to posit is to put something out into the world, to think that something is the case, and to act as it is, and to bring it into reality. So to posit is to bring something into the world, I think. So what is the positing of the natural attitude? Well, he says, a quote, I continually find the one spatiotemporal actuality to which I belong, like all the other human beings who are to be found in it and who are related to it as I am. Now, I find this actuality. Now, the word already says it here, right? As a factually existent actuality, and also I accept it as it presents itself to me as factually existent. So, what is the positing that comes with the natural attitude? Well, the positing is that we treat everything as factually existent, right? And we accept it, and that it's also presenting itself to us in an immediate, intuitive way. And it's also non-voluntary, right? And when I say non-voluntary, that is when I look at the cup of water, right? Even if I close my eyes and open them, it seems to come in again, right? And so, but the positing here is that I posit this thing we've been calling actuality ultimately. But when I posit it, it's not that I'm saying the water is actual. People don't live their lives saying this is actual and this is not, right? People live their lives treating it as if it's actual. So this is an operative condition, right, of the natural attitude. He says, no, he continues to write, no doubt about or a rejection of data belonging to the natural world alters in any respect the general positing which characterizes the natural attitude. That is, what he wants to say is that even when I discover that my knowledge is wrong, I don't stop the natural positing or the positing that comes with the natural attitude, right? So even for instance, let's say it's very common, for instance, that a person who's seen a crime and is a witness will eventually start to misremember rather quickly, actually, what they have experienced. You've probably heard of this in other psychology or maybe philosophy classes, where human beings are actually really, really poor eyewitnesses. We tend to remember what we want to remember, right? But imagine, for instance, you're an eyewitness, and imagine, for instance, you see a sort of crime, right, and you report it, and then suddenly someone shows you a video of what happened, and you were wrong. You were wrong. That is, your memory, maybe even your perception of the events was incorrect, right? Someone proves it to you, for instance. I'm sure this happens occasionally. For instance, this is the job of police, right? Um, but notice that even when I discover that I'm wrong about what I think I know about the world, I don't then stop believing that the world is real, right? Or that the perceptions I'm having of all of these objects in the world are real. So even if I reject the data that belongs to the natural world, this doesn't change the general positing which characterizes the natural attitude. So let's take a look at number 31, this next section. And here's where things get interesting, and we start to see where Husserl starts to sort of turn the screwdriver and starts to move us into a more solid phenomenological plane, right? Section 31 here is the radical alteration of the natural positing, and he calls this excluding or parenthesizing. Now, what he's going to ultimately argue here is that phenomenology, we're ultimately going to do in phenomenology, is we're going to evaluate the descriptions of our experience in terms of the eidetic relations that structurally must be in a transcendental sense in order for me to have the experience I'm having. So, but we need a way in order to actually isolate and, if you will, I would say in order to isolate and identify specific features of our experience that are relevant. But the first thing we have to recognize is that one of the things we can do is we can alter the general positing, right? So here's sort of what he argues, right? Well, in positing, we treat the surrounding world as factually existent, right? We treat it as an actuality. But the positing does not change any features of the experience, right? The positing is actually a sort of judgment, right? Why does the positing not change any features? Because, right, in a philosophy 101 class, right, the professor will frequently say, how do you know that this isn't a dream, right? What's happening there? Well, essentially, what the professor does is they say everything you're experiencing, right, maybe doesn't have actuality, right? They're actually forcing you to exclude the general positing that comes with the natural attitude, right? Because even if it's true that this isn't real, right, that doesn't change that what I'm experiencing is what I'm experiencing, right? So that means that the general positing, if we ignore it, right, is actually a change in judgment, which this means that we can actually treat everything as being on hand, right? And this results in treating everything as on hand, right? Because now I can actually now begin, even if I have unclear ideas, I can begin to understand them in their own on their own terms, right? So in fact, the general positing is what he calls a predicative judgment about the surrounding world. Now recall that if you've taken a logic course, you should. If you haven't, you should. And if you have, good. Right? You'll learn about predicate propositions, right? In every proposition, there's a subject and there's a predicate, right? The subject is what you're talking about, and the predicate is what you're saying about whatever it is you're talking about, really, right? And so it's a predicative judgment. And the idea here is that when we talk about the surrounding world, the subject of the world doesn't change, right? But we alter the predicate, our predicative judgment about the world. That's probably not the best description or explanation, but I'm hoping that'll help you understand what he means here when he talks about predicative judgment. Okay, so what? How does this sort of work? How does this exclusion? And of course, he's well aware that what we're talking about here sounds a lot like Descartes. Remember Descartes' doubt all things that can be doubted. That was, in its own way, it's more than just the suspension or the exclusion of the natural attitude, but it did result in the exclusion of all things actual, right? So what was Descartes doing? Well, Descartes was attempting to doubt universally. He was trying to doubt all things in all ways in all cases, right? That's the most radical form of doubt, which even Descartes discovers it is not possible in the end. It doesn't withstand its own reflection, hence the I think, therefore I am. Okay, so that's the first sort of thing. Now, what did Descartes do? Well, this is just a methodological expedient. That is, Descartes was just trying to speed up his method, right? He's trying to use a method in this sort of device in order to clear away all of the false knowledge that had been built up in his previous conceptions, right? Now, what Husserl then says is that this reveals what we might call our perfect freedom in positing. That is, nothing in the world forces me to posit anything about the world, right, in terms of actuality. Now, notice here we're talking about actuality, and we're talking about the predicative judgments we make when we say that something exists or something has an ontological actuality or something like this, right? But what we realize that here is that since we can exclude things, like while it's true that I don't have perfect freedom in terms of controlling what I'm perceiving, I can't look at the cup and then suddenly blink my eyes and see something different. I can have perfect freedom in terms of whether or not I posit things as having actuality or not, right? I can, in fact, while looking here at my desk and recording this video, I can, in fact, begin to sort of treat the idea that all of my perceptions do not actually have an actuality on the other side, right? And I'm perfectly free to do it. So this is really quite interesting, especially when people want to talk about conceptions of freedom, because it looks like here is that we do have freedom, and the freedom can be demonstratively shown simply by um, the freedom to doubt things universally, right? And so we have a sort of phenomenological freedom, you might say. And we can both doubt something despite its being available to us in the natural attitude. And that was the example I was giving, right? Even though in the natural attitude, the computer is right here before me, right? I can doubt it. And so what does that mean? It means that it's not so much that I'm taking away my experience. I'm not modifying my experience. What I'm doing is I'm modifying my general positing. And remember, since the natural attitude is always available to me, I can always stop modification, as it were, and then treat the world as really what it is. Um, right? And this is what he means by the term excluding, right? Or parenthesizing, right? And so what he's going to then say is that we can start to use this suspension of our general positing, or suspension maybe is not the right term, modification of the general positing, and we can start to realize that we can exclude certain things within our investigation. For instance, we can exclude, for instance, whether or not these things really are here, right? Now, here's a great sort of quote here that I like to include. He says, with regard to any positing, we can quite freely exercise this peculiar epoch, a certain reframing from judgment which is compatible with the unshakable conviction of truth, even with the unshakable conviction of evident truth, right? Now, he's going to use this term epoch here, and I'm going to show it to you here in just a minute, to refer to this sort of exclusion and what we can do when we sort of, I don't want to say pretend, but where we ignore um, and we suspend this general positing that characterizes the natural attitude. We can not necessarily believe that it really is actual, right? He's going to call this the epoch. And we can do this even with things that we really are absolutely certain of. Like, all triangles have three sides. Believe it or not, philosophers have asked the question, do all triangles have to have three sides? That sounds insane. And it also is not, I'm sort of joking a little bit, but there's a sort of unshakable conviction that it's evidently true that a triangle has three sides. But even we can posit, we can suspend this general positing here with the natural attitude. And this is what the parenthesizing judgment is, where every positing related to this objectivity is to be excluded and is converted into a parenthetical modification. So I sort of think about it like this: is how you have parentheses in a sentence. Essentially, what he's saying is the natural attitude is where we sort of have the long sentence of our experience. And what we're doing is that we, in phenomenology, we can parenthesize certain things. We can bracket them out, as it were. And in fact, we'll see later, he actually begins to use that very language. Now, section 32 is very important. It's the phenomenological epoch. So this is the Greek term epoch, or here's the English equivalent epoch. This really, I think, is pronounced something like epoche, right? And what does epoche mean, or epoche? He said epoche refers to this idea that, quote, I am not negating the world as though I'm a sophist when I ignore the actuality of things. I'm not doubting its factual being as though I were a skeptic. Rather, I'm experiencing the phenomenological epoche, which also completely shuts me off from any judgment about spatiotemporal factual being, right? So this is really quite interesting and important. So what's happening here in this, when we can parenthesize and bracket things out, when we can ignore the actuality of something, this is the phenomenological epoch. This is a phenomenological movement here, and it's so important. He gives it a Greek term, right? And an important term at that, right? And so he's not a sophist. He's not a sophist. He's not a solipsist, right? And he's not a skeptic, right? He just recognizes descriptively this is something we can do. We can exercise this phenomenological suspension of the general positing. And he says we accept a proposition only as a form of modified consciousness, right? So that means that what? So if we suspend all of, like, take your experience, you're sitting here watching the video right now suspend the general positing, that is, now analyze and describe your experiences without the assumption that there's actuality here. And what you see is that now the only things we can talk about are forms of modified consciousness. Because after all, that's all I'm left with, right? Okay, so we're going to stop right there here for the next video, which is chapter 2, consciousness and natural actuality. You're going to really enjoy this because we're going to see that this is going to really build up into a really fabulous set of arguments by Husserl. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys online. Okay, bye.